Who would I most like to have a one-to-one with? A man who inspired a generation, Martin Luther King.
I just want to do God's will.
I'd ask him how he coped with being seen as second class just because the color of his skin.
And I've seen the promised land.
And if there was one incident that drove him to become part of the civil rights movement.
Now, if you could pick any historical figure to have a one-to-one conversation with, who would you pick? That was the brilliant question around which the mobile network One-to-One built their successful 1990s campaign. They took the idea of borrowed interest, of featuring a celebrity in your marketing, and multiplied that interest by introducing a famous legend from history. In each commercial, a celebrity would muse on who they'd really like to have a one-to-one conversation with. A young Kate Moss chose Elvis, the footballer Ian Wright chose Martin Luther King, and John McCarthy chose Yuri Gagarin. The spots were beautifully produced with stunning cinematography, imaginatively mixed with documentary footage. The scripts played cleverly with both the public preconceptions of the celebrity and the historical figure. There's a risk in this approach, I think. Some celebrity endorsements might irk fans of the historical figure. And I think the campaign made one misstep in this direction when they chose Chris Evans to talk about John Lennon. It's another well-crafted piece of film, but I don't think the pairing works, and the Tiananmen Square bit crosses the line into crassness for me. But that miss aside, the rest of the campaign was brilliant and built its creative from the intrinsic qualities of the brand and product, inspiring people to think about who they'd have a one-to-one with and bringing the customer into the conversation.
Who would I most like to have a one-to-one with?
It's gotta be Elvis Presley!
56 would be a cool year. He'd be 21. Apparently he really felt lonely at times, even before he was idolised by millions. I'd cheer him up. It would be great to go for a drive with him, pop round his mum's for a cup of tea. I'd ask him who was his best friend. I'd have been a good friend to him, I think. Maybe I'd ask him to sing for me, my own private Elvis Presley concert.
Who would you most like to have a one-to-one with? Our mobile phone service gets people talking.
Who would I most like to have a one-to-one with? A man who inspired a generation, Martin Luther King.
I just want to do God's will.
I'd ask him how he coped with being seen as second class just because the color of his skin.
And I've seen the promised land.
And if there was one incident that drove him to become part of the civil rights movement. Was he ever frightened of those who opposed him? And did he realize how much he frightened them? Most of all, if I could have a one-to-one with him, I'd ask him how he maintained his principle of peaceful protest.
We've got some difficult days ahead.
In the face of such provocation.
But it really doesn't matter with me now. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Who would you most like to have a one-to-one with? Our mobile phone service gets people talking.
Who would I most like to have a one-to-one with? An astronaut. It would have to be the first, Yuri Gagarin. I'd want to know what drove him to sit in that tiny cockpit on top of what was little more than a giant firework. He chose to risk everything. He really did go where no man had gone before, not knowing if he'd ever come back. He was up there for only 108 minutes. It must have seemed like years, if not to him, to his family. If I could have a one-to-one with Yuri Gagarin, I want to ask how he felt about being unknown one day and next morning being the most famous man on the planet. When you've seen the world totally at peace as he did, how do you come to terms with the fact that it isn't?
Who would you most like to have a one-to-one with?